Hello, my name is Leo, and welcome to a new tutorial by Blau Films. Today's tutorial is going to be more 2 or 3 quick techniques and will cover the lightning inside of the clouds with some kind of a volumetric fall off, and we'll have a look at creating some pretty realistic rain inside of After Effects. Now soon I'll be starting some visual effects work on a late at night storm sequence onto the ocean, and it's going to require some pretty complex visual effects when it comes to particle simulations and the ocean and the lightning in the sky, and also the lightning having an impact with the boat that we're on, and then we're gonna have some destruction effects going on there. And I'll soon be making a tutorial on that when I'm done with it. So for now, I thought let's get into the basics of how to create some realistic lightning behind the clouds. So I was scrolling through YouTube and I was recommended this trailer for the Snyder Cut of Justice League. And there's this shot where Ben Affleck is standing right on top of this sculpture and we have some lightning going on into the background. And I thought, you know what, let's just recreate the same composition for the sake of this tutorial. And here's how I did it. Inside of Cinema 4D, let me turn these planes to X-ray real quick. I have imported a Quixel Megascan of a Roman statue, and the camera is kind of pointing upwards, looking right at it. I have a focal length of 50 with a sensor size of 70mm, kind of going for the idea that they had here in the Justice League trailer as well. Having shot on an Arri 65, that would kind of give us the same size of an image that we're getting right now. And then inside of the Corona camera tag, you can see my camera settings themselves. I have an f-stop of 2.8 and a shutter speed of 60. Except for that, it's a highlight compression of 1.2. Bloom and glare has been turned off with the default settings, and the depth of field has been turned on as well. I have a sky with a nighttime HDRI, and then I have 2 very thin area lights that have a intensity of 650 when they are turned on, and they have an intensity of 1 when they are supposed to be turned off. And because I only have 75 frames in here, I basically just hand animated them. I just went from 1 to 650, down to 1, back up to 650. Kind of creating that flickering effect. You can also figure out a different way to do this, like creating a material with a noise and then animating the noise, and then using some espresso to connect the Corona intensity to your noise cycle. For this, I just felt like let's just hand animate it and it works fine. I did a little bit of a camera movement. It's basically a crane up with a tilt down of the head. And as you can see in the back, there's like this plane that has been creating a bunch of little rain particles. We are not really going to be using this rain at all. I didn't even render it out, but it's still in the scene. It was an experiment that I've been playing around with for probably some other project. Now let's have a look at After Effects and see how we actually got to this. First of all, I've imported our asset and I've quickly given it a curves adjustment to match the background, and then I have imported the Cinema 4D file and I have extracted the camera data. Now up till this point, if you've been following some of the tutorials on our page, this is pretty standard. And the next thing I did is I went into our cloud pack and I gathered this asset over here, which is a overcast 5K raw image that I have simply dragged into our project. And then when the camera raw window popped up, I made sure to lower the exposure as much as I could to make sure that we're getting this very dark, hazy look. I've then imported the same asset a second time, and I have increased the exposure of that layer, and I've also increased the contrast a little bit so that we have this strong sunlight coming through these clouds. Now, what we're going to be doing is I've created this mask around this section, and if I set that to add with a feather of about 1000 pixels, what we get is this very strong bluey light that's coming through this area over here. And this is basically what's going to be recreating our idea of the lightning shining through the clouds. Now that's basically the main foundation of this compositing tutorial. If you have a cloud asset that has a wide enough range in color data, you are then able to crunch out the highly exposed area, like, you know, the area where the sun would be shining through, or where you're able to get some pockets of the sky. And then you're able to use that on top of a lower exposed version of that same cloud to create an effect of lightning shining through it. If you come to our ArtStation store, links will be in the description below. You can come to our store section, and we have these bunch of different cloud packs down here. I have been struggling to find high quality cloud assets for as long as I can remember, working in either sky replacements or matte painting or concept art. So I've decided to make them all myself. And in this tutorial, we are mainly making use of this one over here, the 90 plus overcast raw cloud pack. It's all overcast clouds assets. Links to this will be in the description below. And be sure to use this coupon code on the screen right now to get an additional 25% off on your order as a thank you for checking out this tutorial. And because I want you guys to, you know, get your game on and be able to do these kind of things. Now, what I did here is I basically just went into the opacity and I basically hand keyframed it the same way as I had the lighting be keyframed inside of Cinema 4D. Then again, if you have some kind of reference like a luminance map that goes from black to white, you could use that to guide your opacity, and you could use that to guide the opacity inside of Cinema 4D as well, and that would definitely save you some time. Then the next thing I did is I duplicated that layer and I increased the feather to be about 3000, and I luma masked that onto a solid layer of 50%. Now, because I have hand animated the keyframes, we're going from 0 to 100, and I didn't want to make every 100 become 50, so basically I just went to layer new solid, made it 50% gray, and then I luma matted that layer onto that gray solid. Basically that gives you the same result. Every 100% opacity now became a 50% opacity. I then duplicated that layer one more time and I gave it a feather of 5400, and as you can see we are already creating a very nice gradient, a very nice fall off from the bright hot spot in the middle. Now, one thing that you've probably already seen in my timeline, but it's good to mention, is that all these layers are made 3D because we are using a 3D camera from our Cinema 4D file to make sure that these actually move along with our camera once we start doing our crane up and our tilt down. Now, the next thing I wanted to do is I wanted to add a few layers of clouds that go in front of these and that are having some parallax. So I went into the assets pack and I basically imported this other asset over here. And what I did to make sure that I got it some kind of keyed out is I made a duplicate of it and I give it a tint effect, and then I crunched down the gamma correction and I increased the exposure effect. You're able to very smoothly reintroduce how much of those clouds you want to introduce into the scene. One thing that I should mention as well is that the tint effect is actually inverted. So as you can see up here, I've mapped the black to white and I've mapped the white to black, giving you this result over here. This is what I'm using as a luma mask. I've then made 2 more copies of the background cloud with the feather. I then followed up by importing 1 more cloud asset, and I have positioned it even further to the front. Now, if I move to a top view, you'll be able to see over here. The furthest layer we have in the back is the background cloud asset, and then we have a second group right in the middle, and then a third group that's a little bit closer. Those are the only 3 layers of clouds that we will be using to create our parallax effect. I am keying it out in exactly the same way by having a duplicate with a inverted tint effect and a exposure control. And then we have the bottom layer set to luma matte. I have then again created 2 more duplicates of the background feathered exposure layers. And now I feel like we are getting somewhere pretty close when it comes to the levels we need inside of our shot. Now the main thing we have to do is get the actual lighting in there, because animating the overexposed version of your clouds does a pretty good job, but it doesn't really give that volumetric feeling. It doesn't give the idea that your lightning strike is projecting light throughout this entire volume of light. So what we have here is we have this pre-comp right in the middle. It's not a 3D layer, it's simply 2D, and I will show you what that does. There you go. So we are creating a very strong hotspot right over there. Now I should mention that I am working in 32 bits of color over here, otherwise you would probably be getting overexposed way earlier, but when you're working with lightning, don't be afraid of actually creating those hotspots. It's many times that I look at movies and I see that lightning looks 90% white, or it's in some way lightning feels underexposed in many cases. Don't worry about it, because it would probably be the brightest thing you would be getting on camera. So if you're going to be lowering the highlight intensity afterwards, I would recommend you do that on top of your entire image, as opposed to be working with lower intensities on the lighting itself. Now let's get into this pre-comp and you'll be able to see what it is we did. So basically I selected all the layers we have in our previous composition, the background clouds, the camera, even the Cinema 4D file, and a adjustment layer that you will see in a second in the other composition that just gives a camera lens blur of 2. I gathered all of these assets together, I duplicated them in the previous composition, and then hit Command-Shift-C and moved them with all the attributes into this new composition. Then I went and I created a new adjustment layer on top of it, and I gave it a tint effect, and now we have the same 3D camera motion with the 3D clouds layers, but it's black and white. Then I gathered all of these layers together again and I pre-composed them into this layer. So what's the next thing I did? Well, there's this pre-comp 5 over here, and pre-comp 5 is basically, it's a bunch of After Effects advanced lighting effects positioned throughout the scene on the moments that the lightning is hitting. So I've created a black solid, and onto that black solid I went to Effect and then Generate Advanced Lighting. I've played around a little bit with the core radius, and I have lowered the glow settings to basically be 0. Except for that, I just give it a complexity of 5. We don't need too much complexity because we're mainly only going to be using this as a glow and not really as a visible lightning strike. I have keyframed the conductivity state to make sure that it's changing in shape, and I have keyframed the origin and direction to always just be giving some kind of variation. This whole thing has been pre-composed and is this pre-comp 5 over here. Now let me show you all of these effects that we have stacked one on top of the other. Don't worry, it's relatively simple, and it's basically, if you want to have a look at a in-depth look on this, check out Video Copilot's advanced electricity tutorial, I believe that's what it's called. And this solid composite CC composite technique is basically from there. If you look at our advanced lighting, it's a effect that has a alpha channel. Now what you can do is you can then add this effect called solid composite and give it a color of black. And what that does is basically it composites your alpha channel onto a new black solid. Now what you can do is you can add a fast box blur of something like 140, something very extreme, and then you can take an exposure effect with a very high value of about 8 or 9 to then reintroduce some of that light detail. Now then you can add this CC composite effect, which then recomposites the original layer right on top of whatever you're working with now. And now you probably already understand the trick. You add a fast box blur of 96 and the CC composite, and the box blur of 54 and the CC composite, and the box blur of 26. Now this is kind of what you should be aiming for. Now you don't want to be introducing another CC composite with the actual lightning strike. But if that's the case, I wouldn't recommend using this lightning setup you have here. I would create a separate plate where you really work on your lightning and only on your lightning, and then you recomposite that back on top. Now, the next effect we have is we have this set matte effect. And we are taking the matte from the black and white clouds we have beneath, and we are using the luminance channel as the matte. And what that does is basically, if I turn off my alpha channel, you'll see that we are introducing the light in the bright pockets of those clouds. We can then add a exposure effect. And finally, I'm adding a little bit of CC vector blur. Now, if we move back into that composition, you'll see that I did a few more things. I then added a exposure effect on top of that whole thing, and I set the exposure to about 8, and then I color graded it to make sure we have the same hue as everything else in the scene. I have then taken this entire pre-comp 3 and I have duplicated inside of my project window, and that gave me this pre-comp over here, pre-comp 7. And the thing that I did here, which is different, is I went into all of my fast blur effects and I increased the radius like crazy. So we have a radius of 230, a radius of 200. That's giving us a far bigger fall off inside of these clouds. Everything else stays the same, but I've then added that layer on top and I've set it to soft light. And as you can see what soft light does, where it's black, it kind of decreases the values, and where it's white, it increases the values, creating some kind of a vignetting effect without actually going in for a vignette. It's more of a natural vignette that's embedded in the volume of the clouds. I've then created a adjustment layer with a camera lens blur of 2 and a aspect ratio of 0.5. And then I've created this pre-comp called Light Wrap, which is basically I want to create a little bit of a blooming highlight around this still pretty harsh CG render. And the way you can do that is if you duplicate your layer 2 more times and then pre-compose that. And then you take the bottom layer and you alpha invert it on the top one. Basically you get nothing. But then if you add a simple choker effect to the top one, you can then very easily control how much of that layer you're then reintroducing. And essentially you're just getting the edge in that case. What you can do then is add a Gaussian blur on top of that and lower your opacity to about 20, set that to add and duplicate it 3 times. And that gives you a very soft and natural glow around the edges of your subject. The next thing I did is I added a adjustment layer to kinda combine everything together with a fast box blur of 300 and an exposure effect with a gamma correction of 0.6. Now the reason why I did this is I was really looking at how this Justice League example looked like. And one of the things I noticed is that when the lightning strikes, the entire shot kind of hazes up. The light reflects and bounces around so much as if it's very... like, imagine it's like rainy. Imagine it's raining right now, which in the Justice League example, that's the case. And we're about to make it rain in this shot as well. That will mean that there's a lot of humidity in the air. So when something as bright as this lightning would strike, you would get a lot of bounce light from the environment. A nice way to do that would be this, by having an adjustment layer that blurs out your entire shot, and then you use a gamma correction to crunch it a bit down so you don't completely lose all of your shadows. And then you set that to add, and there you go, you have introduced the bounce light from the environment. There's one more thing I did before I talk about the rain, and that's this pre-comp 8 over here. I went to actionvfx.com and I got this asset over here, which is basically just a bit of fog, and I duplicated that layer and I set the bottom layer to Luma Matte, and that way you get rid of the blacks without artificially increasing the values of your shot. If you would like set it to screen or something, or some kind of blending mode. Now you pre-compose those two together and you slap it right on top of it. I have given it a curves adjustment to more accurately match the color of the environment, and then I've given it a camera lens blur of 15 with a aspect ratio of 0.6, well it should be 0.5. And basically what that's doing is just adding a bit more of that bounce light idea, but we're also adding a little bit of motion in there as well because we're using a real fog asset. And finally, we got the rain. Now these two fuchsia layers I have here, those are my rain layers. Let me turn both of them on so you can see what they look like. And as you can see, we have some pretty nice results here. The rain is reflecting all the light. It's kinda refracting the background. We're also getting some dark streaks of rain when we're hitting the light at certain angles, kind of what you would get in a realistic rain situation. Now, the way that I did it is, let's go into this pre-composition. So we have a bunch of little dots here, and inside of here there are two compositions. Now, pre-comp 10 here is basically just our background layer. So this is, if I dive right into it, here you go. It's a duplicate of everything that we were working with up till now, including even the fog asset, but just without the rain. I have duplicated everything and I've pre-composed them together, and that is pre-comp 10. Now, pre-comp 10 is using this super cool effect called CC glass. And we're using the CC glass effect to create a refraction of the background layer, but it's following the shape of our bump map, which is going to be a black and white rain simulation, namely pre-comp 9. So it's time to get into there. I've created the simulation in Trapcode Particular, and I have imported the camera. I've also imported the C4D file in case I need to extract a new camera, and I've made a new solid with Trapcode Particular. I've made sure that I've aligned my particle simulation to be inside of the viewport, and I've made it particularly large when it comes to the X and the Z value, meaning that we have quite a wide amount of particles filling the screen completely. We also have a pretty tall area for our particles to fall in. Now, the reason why usually this would be the Y, and in this case it's the Z axis, it's because of the weird Cinema 4D camera orientation that we're working with. In Trapcode Particular, I had to be working with the Z value. Now, I'm sure that for whatever scene that you're doing, your values will be slightly different. You know, just if you have a question, just let me know and I can definitely help you out. I gave it a pre-run of 25. I have 6 seconds as live. The particle, we're keeping it at sphere because, you know, it's kind of a droplet, should be fine. And the size is at 5. And except for that, nothing really changed except for the gravity, which I've put at 500. We're really using a very strong and very high gravity setting to really drag these particles down, really make it feel as if it's rain, as if it's heavy water falling down, which is the complete opposite of what we did in the Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban tutorial, where we were doing some snow simulations, where ideally you would want them to be super light and almost flying back up into the air. Now, over here, a gravity of 500 and a physics time factor of 1, that's all. And then I just increased the exposure to a ridiculous amount like 9, just really crunching all these particles down to make sure we have no gray values in here. I've pre-composed those layers together. I've turned that layer off. I've set the bump map to that layer. I've set the track matte of the background layer to Luma matte as well. So we're alphaing out only the shape of these raindrops with the animation of the raindrops. And we are also using that animation of the raindrops, creating these CC glass spheres on our background layer that are refracting the original plate. In here, the only things I changed inside of the CC glass layer, I've lowered the shading settings, diffuse to 0, specular to 0, roughness as low as it gets, metal, well, it's at 2, but it could be 0 as well. And then the ambient, you want to make sure that's at 100. If you put it at 200, it will double the values of your shot. If you put it at 50, it will halve them. So keep it at 100 to make sure that you're not introducing any more light into the raindrops than the natural values of your scene. Back to this shot, as you can see, the integration is incredibly natural. And because we're using something like Trapcode Particular, we are also introducing the natural camera movement from our scene, so everything blends in very nicely. Because we have a layer in the foreground, I didn't want to create any complex occlusion objects in between the Trapcode Particular. I thought, you know what, the CC glass experiment is doing fine, but I don't want to overcomplicate things. It's probably gonna mess up at some point. So my idea was, well, just create a duplicate of that whole system, and then inside of here, make a duplicate of the pre-comp that had the rain simulation. And then in there, just move your particles like emitter Y space to 9000, which is the Z space in your case probably. So I moved all these particles way back into the distance. The camera motion stays the same, everything stays the same. We're creating the background far in the distance version of these glass spheres. Back into that pre-comp, everything is the same. We simply have a background layer, luma matting the top layer with a CC glass effect, using that layer, using the rain simulation as a bump map. We're almost done, but what we want to do now is both of these rain layers, as you can see in the effects panel, they have a CC force motion blur effect. I'm just using a shutter angle of 90. I felt like using a shutter angle of 180 would be making it too streaky and not making it look too much like rain anymore. And then we have a camera lens blur of 3 with a aspect ratio of 0.5 on top of it. It's something important for you to think about as well as you are learning visual effects, to kind of have an idea of how far you can get with a certain technique, and then already kind of having an idea of what techniques you can use to pick up the mantle from a certain point on. I knew that I would be able to get a nicely looking rain simulation out of Trapcode Particular, but I wasn't sure that I would be able to be working with CC glass on top of half opacity values that I would be getting from the motion blur out of Trapcode Particular. And I wasn't really sure if it was going to work if I was using some kind of complex particle shape inside of Particular either. Just use the simple sphere inside of the Trapcode Particular and do everything inside of a sphere, and then at the end make sure you have everything pre-comped together and working, and then you add the motion blur, and then you make it look like a streak. Perfect. I've then pre-composed everything together and we went on to make our final adjustments. I've added a exposure effect with a 0.95 gamma and a 0.1 exposure, just that little bit of a contrast. I've then added a color correction tritone effect, and in here I was trying to get a rough match of the colors that we were getting in this Justice League trailer. I gave it a shadow color of a very dark purple and a mid-tone color of a very cyan-y, tealy color, and then a highlight of a lime green yellow kind of look. I then gave it a blend with original of 25. Usually I would never go this low. Usually I would go for about 95%, like really just giving it a very subtle detail. But in this case, because it's a pretty stylized shot that we're getting at the end, a value of 25 was doing perfectly fine. I then created a curves adjustment in which I have lowered most of the shadows, but I've then given it one more point in the middle to make sure we don't mess too much with the shoulders of our curve. I've then created a adjustment layer with an exposure effect one more time, and I've added the adjustment layer with a vibrance effect, lowering the vibrance to -35, matching the saturation of the images we have in the reference. And then I created one more adjustment layer with a vignetting effect. I double clicked the elliptical mask tool, and then I selected both the left and the right Bezier curve, and I pulled up the arcs to the top and bottom of the frame, creating this kind of a rounded square look. I have set the mask to subtract, and I give it a feather of 200. I gave it an exposure effect one more time of 0.87 and a camera lens blur effect of 10. We are blurring the edges here a bit and we're giving it a bit more of a darkness. And finally, I'm using a Cine Classico grain. It's a pretty light grain, so I've given it 3 duplicates. I wanted really to give that grungy, Justice League kind of vibe. So yeah, here you go. Those are some quick techniques for creating realistic cloud thunder and cloud lightning effects. And also some quick tips on how to create realistic rain inside of After Effects. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you very much for those who are recently subscribed to this channel. We are almost reaching 500 subs, which might not sound like a lot, but it's very impressive to me and the crew that we actually got here, and we will be keeping making a lot of new stuff. We're getting close to finishing our most ambitious project yet, Syntactic Labyrinths. It's a science fiction short film about the end of humanity and what we will do with all of our knowledge once we're long gone and once we're dead. And it's a very cool project. There's a bunch of very talented artists that are involved, and I'm very excited to share it with you. And we'll be sharing a lot of tutorials and behind the scenes content as the film releases and in the future around there. So yeah, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, and cheers. Have a great night. Bye bye.